Everybody, I'm really excited about this one. My guest today is Kent Murawski. Kent is a coach. He's a speaker. He's a two-time author. He is a former pastor. He's a church planter. And Kent, I would say most importantly, you are a husband of 23 years, a father of 3 wonderful children. And I'm just going to share here as we start talking, Kent and I had a chance to connect at an event a few weeks ago, immediately hit it off. I said, I got to have this guy in the podcast. He's awesome. I had a chance to see you speak as well. And I love the content that we're going to speak about today. And it is so meaningful. It's something that everybody can identify with. So Kent, so good to have you here. Welcome.
Hey, Jason, thanks so much. Glad to be here with you and your audience. And thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, Kent. So we are going to talk about a number of things today. I think we're going to get to know you a little bit. And the primary focus of this episode today, and just to share with the audience, the content that I was really struck by is you have a really excellent framework and way of looking at burnout specifically, among other things you do. And I would assert that there's nobody listening to this episode who hasn't felt either that or close to burnout in their life. So before we let's get to know you through the story that you opened your speech with about what led you to burnout, because I think that's a powerful way to start here. So Kent, why are you so passionate about the topic of burnout?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just back up a second, Jason, and say I really enjoyed meeting you at the Mastermind meetup and just your curiosity as we hung out on that Friday night at the restaurant, and your generosity. Yeah. You bought me a drink and you bought my dinner. So thanks for that. But
I don't even remember doing that. That's perfect. I appreciate that. That's great.
Well, yeah, as far as burnout's concerned, it came to me learning how to overcome that in a hard-won way. So I was, let's see how it was many years ago now, but the year was about 2004. I was, I think, 28 years old, maybe 27. And I was set to go to a weekend conference for a training for leading college students, which was something I was doing at the time. And instead of going to the training, I fell down on the floor that day. It was a Friday afternoon. I remember it very clearly. I fell down on the floor, curled up in a ball, and I cried like a baby for what seemed like 2 to 3 hours. I really don't know how long it was, but that's what it seemed like to me. And I really didn't know what was happening. You know, looking back, I think it was a mini nervous breakdown. Maybe it wasn't so many. I don't know, but that's how I would call it now. And I hadn't been paying attention to the signs, Jason. So, I had been anxious for 2 or 3 months leading up to that, like to the point where, and some of your listeners would understand this, maybe you do too, I would wake up at night and feel like I was crawling out of my skin. Like I couldn't sleep. I felt down and depressed, and that wasn't my normal demeanor. I was not healthy physically either. I was a youth pastor at the time and a college pastor, so I was eating too much pizza. Way too much.
I was going to say pizza.
It was awful.
Cheap pizza too.
Eating out all the time. But beyond that, I remember my doctor telling me at 27 years old, Kent, you have high triglycerides. And so I was 30 pounds more than I am now at 48 years old. There was just so many areas of my life out of whack. And not to mention, I was overworking. So the youth pastor, the college pastor, that wasn't my full-time gig. That was a part-time gig on top of a full-time gig. Add to that, I was leading a music program with my wife for a church of 400 people. And I was like the poster child for burnout. So that's kind of the story that was the inciting incident, I guess you could say. Yeah.
And then from there, you were a pastor for quite a few years. This is something that I think a lot of people will come to their spiritual advisors or pastor, or whoever that person is for them, to talk about. And I think this is really normal. And I know that your framework is useful for everybody, but I just want to call this out. This is very common in church leadership specifically. Yes. Very common, just like it is in things like nonprofits, because most of the time you're under-resourced and overworked because there's just not enough. So many hands make work. You're like, we don't have enough hands. So it is a lot of work. Yeah. And isn't it?
You add to that, Jason, and when you add to that, there's some sense of, I'm doing the work of God. And so there's nothing I can't give and nothing I can't do, and boundaries go out the window. And because you think you're doing it for God, so to speak, it means that you way overdo it, and a lot of ministers don't have healthy boundaries. So
yeah, that's tough. Well, let's talk about. I've got a couple of get to know you here questions, Kent, for the audience to get to know you, like I've gotten to know you, and I'm going to learn something. I always like these questions. I'm going to learn something as well. So let's talk about. I want to know something that you really nerd out about, and this I don't want to hear the Bible or studying burnout. I want to hear like a thing you actually just nerd out about.
Yeah, I would say one thing I nerd out about is I call it analog living. Like, so we live in a digital age. I drive my kids crazy with this. Like,
I'm getting driven crazy just hearing about this right now. This is so out of my comfort zone.
No, that's not to say I don't use technology. I don't like technology, because I do,
Yeah.
but I want it to support the values in my life rather than using it, whether to numb out, whether using it for other purposes. If the technology supports my values, then I want to use it. So for me, what that looks like is every year around January, I do a digital detox. So it's kind of like a zero balance budget where you take off everything you don't need on your phone for work, or for that you have to have there.
Yeah.
And then you reintroduce it after a month of doing that. But you're not just taking something away. And I got the idea from Cal Newport. He wrote a book called Digital Minimalism.
Yeah.
But you're not just taking the technology away, you're adding in things that go with your values, because when you just try to like white knuckle something, it doesn't work. Yeah. And so you're adding in spending time with family, doing things you love, doing healthy leisure activities and fun leisure activities, the things that revolve around your values. So I nerd out about it. I drive my kids crazy with it.
Yeah. I'm guessing and I think you're a father of 3. How old are your children?
Yeah. My oldest is 19.
I'm sure they're super into this. That sounds like something most 19-year-olds are like, oh, I'd love to do a digital detox.
Well, yeah, I won't say too much about his digital habits, but even thinking about this podcast, talking to cool people, I was like, I'm not so sure my teenagers would agree with you on that, Jason. I'm not even sure they like me, and sometimes I don't like them either. So I love them, but sometimes I don't like them.
That's
so my
exactly
middle's 17-year-old, she's a senior, and then my youngest is 10 years old, and we call him a happy ending. So
you're happy. That's so cool. Yeah, I think my kids are younger, but I think my daughter is almost 8, and it's quickly coming where she's like, how are you able to host that? Because I don't think you're that cool. Like, there's a lot of sighing and eye rolling and just a lot of the 7 going on 17. Yeah,
cool
I think that's right. It's all relative. That's great, Kent. So let's see. What else do I want to know? You're obviously an extremely accomplished speaker, as I think most people who lead churches have to be. So I'm curious. And you've spoken on, I can only imagine how many things you've spoken on over the years. So if you had to boil it down and I said, hey, Kent, you have 5 minutes and everybody in the world is going to hear this part of the podcast. In other words, what's the one message you have that you want everybody to know? And it's 5 minutes or less. No, don't deliver. Just what are you going to talk to us about? And what do you want us to do at the end of that message?
Yeah, that was a great question and a tough question. You did send me that ahead of time. I had trouble answering it a little bit because there's so many things you could share, right? But I think my life message, if I had to boil it down, is, and it goes along with what I talked about with burnout, though I might phrase it slightly differently, is that true success and fulfillment comes from wholeness and integrity, not achievement. As a driven person, I used to think that it was all about achievement, until I burned out and had a many-year process where I learned to be healthy and whole. And I realized it's really about wholeness and integrity. And what I mean by that is integrity literally means to be complete or whole. We often think of it as moral character or purity, and it is that. It's not less than that, but it's more than that. It really means being complete and whole. And I think we have a lifetime to live that out. So my call to action would be redefine success according to your values and according to what it means to be whole. I think that would be my message.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up integrity. The coach training program I went through, we had a whole module on integrity and how it relates to coaching and coaching clients, and integrity of ourselves, of course, as service providers, we always need to be doing our work as well, is what I say. And we defined it in that program as not a moral thing at all, which I kind of hear you're saying as well. And it was really, I think, Gandhi's definition of your thoughts align with your words, align with your actions. And that's what integrity means.
Yeah.
And I hear that you're saying something similar and like, hey, my values are this, which comes from head and heart and soul and hopefully from other good influences. Some people's values come from other places. And then you're going to talk about those things. And I love this. And I'm sure you probably use this in your frameworks. Like so Kent, you say you're committed to blank. Jason, you say you're committed to blank. And then I was able to watch you for a day, or I was able to look at your bank statement, the pictures on your phone, and your calendar. Would those things align? Would I believe you if I investigated that? And I think I would say for me, that's not always true. I would say for most people, that's not always true because life gets in the way.
All of us.
And the call is to always be, to me, that's a striving. Integrity is a striving, and because it's just nearly impossible to have integrity all of the time around everything.
Yes.
And and I'm sure that you probably know some quite famous people in ministry from conferences and seeing them speak. And those are some of the people that, like, when you learn about it, you're like, these people are not people of integrity, unfortunately.
Yes.
Which is a real shame.
It is.
So Kent, let's talk about, I'm really curious about your path to church planting. So for those listening who are interested in that, I always think of church planting. I said, that sounds so challenging to plant a church. It's not like somebody goes, hey, Kent, go plant a church. Here's $1 million check. Maybe that happens.
Not very often. Not that I know.
Not very often. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your journey to church planting. And love to hear you share with the audience and like your experience with that and what led you to that calling and what had you shift into something like that. I know you and I had this conversation. That was really fascinating about your shift in your life.
Yeah. So the beginning, the foundation of it began when I was in college. I did not grow up. I grew up, my parents dragged me to church. Literally when I was a teenager, they had to drag me out of bed.
Me too.
I did not want to go.
Yeah. Me too.
My priest once, we used to go on Saturday night when I got to be a teenager, when I was, with my friend, and we'd sit up in the balcony because we didn't have to, really engage with the service. And he could see up there. We thought there was like this sort of half pony wall that he couldn't see. And then there were these risers and we were playing army crawling around on the floor. And he told my parents. And so I was not into church when I was young. I got into college and I just tried everything under the sun, looking to fill something that was a big void, in my heart. And so, I did a lot of drugs. I had a lot of sex. I drank a lot of alcohol, and none of it did anything. And so it was in college that I won't go into the whole series of events, but through a seemingly random meeting, I met a person who introduced me to what the gospel is, a relationship with Christ. And over the next several months, when I came into a relationship with Christ, I felt like he was literally there asking me to surrender my life. And so it was very shortly after that, Jason, that I felt I guess this is a religious word. Some people may understand, some not, a call to be a pastor. And so what I mean by a call is like an invitation, a sacred invitation from God to do that. And so I sensed that in my heart. I felt that. And then I worked, in different local churches for a number of years before I planted a church. And so specifically the church planting, though, because that's what you asked about, what happened with that was I was leading a network of campus ministries based out of Rochester, New York. And this might sound weird to some, but I'm just going to go there. So I'm sitting in my office and I had, I guess, a vision, you could say. It was a mental image in my mind as I was praying. And I saw this huge heart beating. It was placed over Boston and it was pumping life in every direction. And the funny part is I had never been to Boston. And so I felt like, the Lord was somehow leading me there. I made a trip there with some friends and I just felt like this. A lot of people say it's a hard place. It's spiritually dark, so to speak, all these different things. But I felt alive when I came here. And so fast forward, over the next 3 years, I traveled to Boston about 25 times, just helping churches with campus ministry, how to start those. And then eventually just felt led for lack of a better word, to come and start a church. And Cambridge specifically was always the place that I had been drawn to. So if you're familiar with Cambridge, it's right across the river from downtown Boston.
Yep.
And we were our church was sandwiched right in between Harvard and MIT. So that was kind of the long,
a lot of real
short.
woo woo people there. People real spiritual, not not a lot of intellectual.
No, none at all.
No big thinkers at all. Like, how does this all make sense?
So yeah, that was a bit of the story, and you're right. It's very difficult. In fact, today I was sitting in my chair over here thinking, like, I can't believe we did that. Like, we dragged 3 kids across. Well, it was 2 at the time. 2 kids halfway across the country. We moved right into downtown Cambridge, which is it's called Central Square. And if you know anything about Cambridge, it's a city of 100,000 people, which doesn't seem that big, but they're crammed into 6 square miles of territory. So it's actually the 5th most densely populated city in the United States. And so, we had moved from the country. And so here we were coming from the country, moving to the city, and it was crazy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, maybe outside of marriage and child rearing. Those 3 probably rank as the hardest things. And it profoundly shaped me. It was one of those things that you look back on and you wouldn't trade for the world. And at the same time, you say, that hurt so deeply, but it made me a better person.
Yeah. It's part of your hero's journey. That was part of your path. So Kent, there's obviously a lot of time here that you did this work. You were doing the pastoral work, and then you decided not to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about that process, because I'm really curious, somebody who's never felt this calling, nor do I think I'd be very good at it. It's probably part of it too, is you were called in. Like I say, you were called in. My assertion would be that you were felt called out, or I don't know if they experience it being pushed out or called, if it's like, if you felt you were called into something different, or it's more like, this isn't for me. Like, I'd love to hear about your experience of when you knew this isn't actually what I'm here to do any longer.
Yeah. That was a really hard process, to be honest with you, because when I received that call into, I felt like I thought that was going to be a lifetime calling.
Which for a lot of pastors and priests and reverends, that's it. That's what you're doing until you retire.
And I like to say, Jason, I really believe that we all have a calling, because I don't like the separation between, because this person's doing something, again, for the Lord or religious, that's somehow more sacred or better than the person that's sweeping the floors or in business. I just don't separate those things. But I thought I was going to be doing it for a lifetime. So what happened was, in 2022, I took a sabbatical, a 2-month sabbatical. It was the first time I had ever done that. And I had been growing restless and sort of bored, honestly, in what I was doing for about 2 years, maybe 18 months before that. And I just was like, I've got to figure something out, because this isn't going away. So I took a sabbatical. And the way I like to describe it is, I don't know if you ever played in streams when you were young, like little creeks and stuff, but we had one right behind my house, and we'd catch crayfish.
Yeah.
Now, the crayfish would often be like sticking out just a little bit from under a rock. And if you didn't move the rock carefully enough, all the dust in the stream would stir up, and it was 20 minutes before you could catch the crayfish, right? But what happened when I was on sabbatical, it was kind of like that. I slowed down enough where the dust settled, and I came to this awareness that I can't do this anymore. And so, I think the boredom played into it. I really discovered that I wasn't using enough of my strengths and abilities. And what I mean by that is, I believe a strength is something that you're good at and brings you joy. So there's some things we're good at, but they don't bring us joy. That. So I wasn't using enough of my strengths and abilities in the ministry I was doing. And I was unfulfilled in that. But even apart from that, I had opportunities to go lead other churches. I just didn't sense that was the next direction for my life. And I wrestled with that for a couple of years, to be honest. But I finally came to the realization that wasn't the next phase of my life. And I was okay with that.
Yeah. What about your wife? How did that, how did it go with her when you partnered up with her?
She was ready way before me.
Yeah. She's like, honey, it's about time. Like, I've been gently coaching you, or maybe not so gently coaching you, for a long time.
Yeah, she was wonderful through the whole process, but she was definitely ready a couple years before I was, and was like, thank God you finally came to that realization, Ken. and not that I regret it. And just because it's hard doesn't mean it wasn't worthy. It was time. That's the best way I can say it, I guess.
Yeah. Did you know what you wanted to do? Were you side hustling some of the business that you have now while you were doing that? Did you know what was next for you when you decided to leave that from a strengths purpose, not from I need to make money for the family, but like, here's what I actually want to spend my time and give out and put out? Did you already have that pretty much lined up?
Yeah, I knew some of that because interestingly enough, before all this happened, it was right before COVID in 2020 that I had felt like my purpose was really foggy. For the first time in 20 years, I felt like I don't know what my purpose is. So this goes into the digital detox. For 3 months in 2020, I went off social media. I limited my web access and I took a deep dive on purpose. I journaled, read books, I went back to the scripture, and I discovered at that point, it wasn't the big questions of life that were tripping me up. It was they're not small, but smaller in relation questions like, what are my strengths and abilities and what brings me fulfillment in my work? And I discovered it was things like writing, speaking, coaching, teaching, creating, innovating, creating resources and things for people to help them grow. And that's what I really am passionate about and love to do. And I wasn't using enough of that other than the speaking in the church setting. But even the speaking there, I wanted to speak about different topics and just explore different things that I couldn't do there. So because when I saw you speak, there's an element of the pastoral work you do, but I think this is a good transition point to get into. At a high level, I'd love for you to share with the audience the framework that you came up with, because burnout is something that I have a lot of clients that talk to me about. I don't know that I've fully experienced it. I think I've been fortunate. I don't know if it's a personality thing but I've come close a few times. I know my wife has been there, and I haven't know a ton of people have. I just love how you've created something that is easy for people listening. And we're going to talk about how they can actually take this exercise for themselves at the end here. Can look at this and go where am I? So Ken, I'd love if you would share with us kind of the impetus for where you came up with what you're going to share with us here, and then just walk us through it at a high level. Sure.
And one of the things I would say, I love having people like you, people that do ministry work that I've interviewed, especially pastors that I've interviewed a few, like Pete Wilson, and there's a couple other. You all have it down to a science on how to take topics that could be so complicated and making it simple, actionable, and understandable, but not because we're dumb, but because we have a million other things going on. Because and then that's kind of what I think the best pastors do. Let me take these complex things and make them meaningful, and then so you walk out of here on Sunday or Saturday night and you know what to do next. So, Ken, love to hear about this.
Yeah, and I think any good communicator does that, right? They take complex things and make them simple. But I would be interested to know, before I jump into that, Jason, what has been how have you, in what ways have you experienced or felt burnout in your own life? I'd love to hear just a bit about that.
Wait a second. This is my podcast. It's when you get two coaches on a line. I'm like, wait, hold on a minute. No, I would say
what elements of that?
No, for sure. I'm happy to share this. And I'm joking, because that actually one of my workflows is ask Jason anything. So I'm just being a little facetious. I think the closest I ever came to burnout and how I've experienced it was when I started my own business, and it was narrow in focus, and the majority of my time is spent doing one thing. And I just felt like this can't be it. Won't go into the details there, but my personality is such that I get bored easily. I'm impatient. I come from a sales background, fast mover, type A, love people. I love results. Not going to lie. I love getting results. I love to gamify things. And I wasn't feeling like I was making an impact on others as much as I wanted to, but I also just knew, man, I got so much more to offer. And it's just the scope of it was too small. And then our son was born. And that was in October of 2020. So as we know was happening in October of 2020, arguably like the worst couple of months of the pandemic period, because it's like there's a vaccine coming, but it's not ready yet. And there are a lot of people were dying that fall. And and everybody was in a different shift. And I just remember thinking, I'm supposed to be happy that I have a second child. I'm happy that he's here, but I'm like not present, and I'm not feeling good. I should be, again, this is a trap.
Mm-hmm.
I should be blank.
Yes.
Then you put that expectation on yourself of, well, society says when you have a baby, you should be happy. And it wasn't that I wasn't happy with him, my wife, or our family. Yeah. I'm sure you probably hear this a lot. I don't know if I would call that burnout. It's definitely the most depressed I've ever been.
Yes.
Most depressed. I think I had some anxiety, most likely because I left a corporate job. And when you're working for yourself, and you know this from doing, say, people that are planting churches are also entrepreneurs. Like, there's no doubt that's like, you're like a startup founder. You are literally starting things up. And now you run your own business again. You know this, that if you're sitting there and you're like, is this really all there is? And it just feels hard. Go back and work for somebody else. Cause I liked my career. I liked my corporate career. And I just remember I had a moment where I was like, why am I doing any of this? I'm making less money. It's more pain. It's okay. It's not bad, but I made way more money doing something that was that quite frankly was easier. Didn't require as much energy from me. I kind of not do it in my sleep, but it was like something I knew how to do. And that was the closest I came to burnout.
Yeah.
Probably more of like a depression, like a mild depression than burnout. But I did have moments, and I'll just call out what it was. I had a lot of one-on-one clients. And at the end of the day, I just said, this is a lot of work for not that much money. And it was not, and the clients were great, but when you go back, and I'm a back-to-back-to-back stack kind of time person, that gets exhausting. Even if you love the clients, you love the work. And the good, and you didn't ask me this part, but the good news about this story is I've really created additional opportunities in my business and additional things that I do that you and I have talked a little bit about, that it's my life's purpose. Like, it's like the thing that 90 minutes, 2 hours feels like 5 minutes. I get done. I don't imagine myself ever getting bored of it. It's kind of like speakers, like, speakers that love to speak, they don't ever get bored of it because they're performing and they're getting to interact. So that was definitely the closest I've ever been to that. I've never had a fall on the floor moment. I've never had that type of reaction. I think quite frankly, you're probably more emotionally available than me around that. I think for me, it would take a lot to get there, but doesn't mean it couldn't happen someday.
I'm actually glad you shared that, because I think a lot of people haven't had the fall on the floor moment. I mean, I was like, I equate that to being blatantly, tremendously unself-aware. And a lot of people are more self-aware than I was at that time. I just had zero self-awareness. And so that's probably why it led to that. But I'm glad you shared what you shared, because I think a lot of people feel what you feel at one time or another, or maybe feeling that way right now, which is, we're not in full burnout, but we feel frayed at the edges.
Yeah, totally.
And we don't know why, right? And you brought up some things. I think for a lot of people, it is the work situation, whether it's a transition with a job or whether I'm in a job I hate. That's such a big part of our lives. If we think about it, we spend 1/3 of our adult lives working. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of time when you consider we spend 1/3 working, 1/3 sleeping, and then 1/3 something else, right?
And that's something else when you have a family and such isn't really always the things that you would choose to use that time for.
Right. It's like you have, that's your family, that's your hobbies, that's your leisure, that's your faith community, that's all the other stuff jammed into that. So work is a big deal. And if we're feeling either we don't like what we're doing, or we're not using our strengths, or we don't feel purpose in it, then it's easy to get burnout. Yeah, I think a lot of people feel frayed at the edges. And what I found is, so I put the framework that you were talking about, how I put it is, I call it the REST framework. It's capital REST. And what that stands for, well, let me actually give you a little bit of background about this.
Yeah.
So when I say true success and fulfillment comes from integrity and wholeness, not achievement, I think what I'm leading up there to is, we try to put we try to solve complex problems with complicated solutions. So what I mean by that is I heard Arthur Brooks, he's the happiness professor from Harvard there. And he was talking about this one time. And his dad was a biostatistician. And so he would bring up conversations like this when they were little. He said, kids, there's two types of problems. You've got complicated problems that can be solved by technology or a mathematical formula. And you've got complex problems which can't be solved with that. So the difference is like a toaster is complicated, but a cat is complex, right? A jet engine's complicated, but a human being is complex. Love is complex. And here's the problem. We're all looking for love and identity and fulfillment and all those things. But what the solutions we're being given are complicated mathematical solutions or tech solutions that don't solve complex problems. So that's how I think about burnout. Human beings are complex beings. We're not going to solve burnout or our unfulfillment or our lack of identity or any of those things with complicated solutions or tech or mathematical formulas. It just doesn't work. And so that's why I say...
Or a coaching program that like tells you how to avoid burnout, because no.
And so the best definition I like for wholeness is in the Hebrew tradition. So a lot of different traditions probably embrace this, but in the Hebrew tradition, there's this word and concept called shalom. Yeah. And you've probably heard that before. Sometimes it's used as a greeting.
Sure.
But it's more than a greeting. Yeah. But it's more than a greeting. It actually means, similar to integrity, it means wholeness, completeness. Everything is all right. In other words, you could say it's the way things should be. And shalom, when it's a verb, means this. And I love this. This is kind of the core of the REST framework. Actions that lead to a state of wholeness.
Beautiful.
And so these are the actions that I think lead to the state of wholeness. And again, like you said, there's no formula. It's not a hack or a tip or a trick.
No.
It's like things we'll be practicing our whole lives to do these actions that will lead us more towards wholeness. So R stands for relational. And I kind of put 3 subcategories around each. So relational, that would be your inner circle. That would be comrades, coaches, and counselors. And then that would be your community or tribe. So that's relational wholeness or health.
Yeah.
The E stands for emotional. And, you could probably lump lots of things under these, but I just tried to stick with 3 for each. The E stands for emotional. That stands for your feelings, your mind and your intellect, and your will or volition. In other words, your decision-making ability.
Yeah.
The S stands for spiritual. And what I mean by that too is some people aren't, I happen to be, identify with the Christian faith. Some people don't, but that could be your faith or your philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And I encourage people, you either need to have a faith or you need a deep philosophy of life. Okay. And so under the spiritual, I'd put things like identity and purpose, rest or Sabbath. And I could talk about that term if you want. And then spiritual practices or disciplines. So that's the S. And then finally, the T in rest is what I call tangible. That would be your vocation, which, your job and finances, your service and your mission. And what I mean by that is we all should, I don't want to say should, it's healthy for us to be pouring out towards things and people that can do nothing for us in return. And so your vocation, your service and your mission, and then your physical health, which would be eating, sleeping, and exercise. Yeah. So that's kind of the framework and how I break it down.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. And I love the way
I shared with you a picture that I drew from the mastermind group. So just for the audience, when Kent presented this, the challenge was, and I think we're going to talk about this, and I'll share this in the show notes. I'll actually just share this diagram. The challenge for everybody and the exercise here is, how are you doing? It's a little bit like the wheel of life, except I like it because I think it's actually more simple. Now, what I would say about this is literally preaching to the choir in this one. These things are in flux all of the time, and to have them all at a state of like, that's a 10 out of 10. Yeah. I can look at, I'll speak for myself here for a minute. I'm looking at this framework on my screen right now. I would say I'm probably higher in all these categories than I've ever been, but I can also point at a bunch of areas where I'm like, that. Well, that's really good. But then
And like and as a coach, a lot of like we love either ors.
Yeah.
Oh, I can be really physically fit, but then I can't spend as much time with my kids, or in the either or context, which doesn't feel like a context or a belief for a lot of people. It feels like the truth. And in some ways it is, because I can't be making money and working and also hanging out with my 2-year-old. Like those two things don't work together. So, well, thanks for doing that. So for the audience listening, I'm going to put this in as a link on the Google Drive inside of the show notes, and that'll be there. Download this. This is Kent's sketch. I can tell that either you have naturally good handwriting or you've had to work on it as a pastor, because if I did this, people would go, I don't have any idea what this says.
Yeah, so I don't have good handwriting, but I was meticulous when I wrote this out.
Yeah, well, I think that the pro tip was that you actually wrote it out before you spoke, which I'm like, oh, that's brilliant, because mine, it would be chicken scratch. So Kent, what's the thing? Let's bring it back to you here, because the audience will read this, and we'll talk about how you can connect with Kent here shortly. But Kent, I'm curious about, for you, what's the thing that you're really working on inside of the REST framework? Like, what's the thing that you would most like to see movement on for yourself?
Sure. Well, let me qualify this a couple of quick ways. First of all, at the mastermind meetup, the statement that I used for my talk was that the secret to beating burnout is not work-life balance, it's wholeness. And the reason that I shared that, Jason, I think is important for your listeners to understand is balance is the wrong term, because the word means equality. And we all know that life is not equal. Again, we talked about we sleep for 8 hours, we work for 8 hours, and we jam everything else into the other 8 hours. So people have the right concept about what work-life balance is. It's not equal, but appropriate attention. And I get all that, but it's the wrong term. And I think wholeness is a better term. So I want to start with that.
Yeah.
As far as what I'm working on, I think this can be overwhelming for people, because I was talking to I like to test my theories on people. And so I'll just talk to people about it. And the best way to learn something is teaching it. So I was talking to a friend of mine about this one day, and she said, this is, I exactly relate to what you're saying, but there's so many areas that I need work in. And I said, it's okay. And here's why. You start with the area of the most pain. Mm-hmm. Pain is an indicator of where we need to start. So when you ask me which ones I'm working on, I'm looking at the ones that are pain points, and where I want to start is the one that's the greatest need or pain point. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
The relational on the community and tribe piece. So since we transitioned from no longer leading a church, we're now in that state of flux where we're looking for a community to connect with, but we haven't found one yet. And so I feel I have good friends. That's a blessing. I have my family. That's a blessing. It's wonderful. But we're lacking that sort of community and tribe in some ways. And so right now we're in a process of visiting places and trying to find a place to connect. And we have some values within that are important to us. But that's one of the things that's one of my focuses for this quarter. I really move more in trimesters. But on the tangible side, it's vocation and finances. Again, because I transitioned, I'm starting to establish my business. Like, that's front and center for me, because it's like, this is like make or break time, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a focus of mine. In the spiritual area, I'm kind of retooling my rest and Sabbath rhythms. And by Sabbath, that's again a Hebrew concept, but all it means is to cease or to stop work. So when we Sabbath, what we're doing is we're taking a 24-hour period away from work, and we're not doing emails. We're not doing anything that feels like productivity in the sense of my job or vocation. Now, that's not like one of the things that gives me life is like, I call it puttering in the garage. Like, so I go in my garage, I build things. I'm not
Kent
great at
tool,
it.
You're like Kent the tool man. Yeah,
exactly. I just hung some drywall the other day. I'm not great at that, but in my basement. So I like to tool around, and that gives me life. So it doesn't mean that we have to sit on a couch all day.
Yeah.
It just means we stop working for 24 hours.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. I that's something that I have tried to implement, is take one day off on the weekend, because this as a parent and as, running your own business, it's just you and it's just me. And yes, we might have support of our spouse and I have some, assistant stuff or whatever. But at the end of the day, there's always more to do. There's always something more to do. And for a long time, I was trapped in the oh, the weekends are when I do the admin work or whatever, because you're not generally meeting with people.
Yes,
I've knocked that off, and it has made a huge difference in my
it
life.
does.
I will choose either Saturday or Sunday to go, nope, not opening the computer today. Today is the day I'm going to get whatever I feel like doing, and I'm not going to do work. So that's been great. To offer, that's what I've been working on, and doing that for me also is useful for the relational part and for the emotional part, because I get out of that. I have to do something. I should do something. Right. And what that means. And I was just talking to our mutual friend, Dr. Eugene, earlier today about the worst thing is the shoulds. Oh, I should do this. I should do that. I need to do that because if I do that, then that's blank, blank, blank. He's like, yeah, that's fight, flight, or freeze mode. That's fight mode. That's fight mode.
Yeah.
Or flight mode.
That's right.
I'm avoiding the conversation with my wife so I can go out and do emails in my office. Right. So Kent, as we wrap up here, I want to ask you one of the questions I love to ask first time guests, and you'll obviously be a second time guest. Call this the therapy question. And then we'll talk about how people can connect with you and such. So Kent, what's something that you are afraid is actually true about you?
Yeah, I thought that was such a good question, by the way. And I'm going to rephrase it just a slight bit, but I think it's in the same spirit. I rephrase it as this: what's something you are afraid of that could come true? And the reason I say that is because fears are real because they reveal what's actually important to us.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And so one of my fears, and my counselor taught me to ask this question, because I can just overthink things and I take them to the worst case scenario sometimes. Like
a catastrophizer. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he taught me to ask, what is the worst thing that could happen out of this situation? What's the best thing that could happen? Because most of the time it's somewhere in between. Yeah. The vast majority of the time. So in other words, say your greatest fears, say the best things that could happen, and it's probably not going to end up either. Right. But a couple of things that that are fears for me that could, I'm afraid of coming true is, that my kids won't want to come home once they leave the house. So relationships really important to me, but I failed so many times, whether it's yelling at my kids or not, shaming them or doing things that we know better than doing. But at the same time, wanting that deep relationship and doing things to cultivate that. And so I sometimes wonder, have I done enough to connect with them where they'll want to come home and be here when they don't have to be?
Yeah.
So that's one. Same on like with me and my wife. Like we have a great relationship. It came through like years of struggle and lots of counseling too. But
and then you left the church, and then you left the church. She's like, maybe this guy finally gets me.
Yeah, exactly. But the fear there is like, will we end up divorced one day because we'll grow apart?
Yeah. Yeah.
Those types of questions. Or another one for me is, maybe will I really reach my full potential?
Yeah.
Right.
One of the great human
maybe
fears.
None of us will. Maybe none of us will reach our full potential, but that's like a lot of guys. Well, a lot of people in general struggle with, am I making an impact in the world? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that last one you mentioned, I would be shocked if there's anybody listening who doesn't have that fear. I think that is a very human thing. And I really appreciate you sharing those. And the thing I would add there is, I was thinking about for myself how, and I've answered this question a few times, is what do we make our kids not coming home or getting divorced or not making an impact? What is that? What do we interpret that to mean about us? Like, what does that mean about us? And again, like talk about Eugene, but now we're talking about therapeutic work as well. Is you can almost always point back to some sort of childhood something around all of it and go like, yep, that thing, that's how I was raised, or that's how I was, raised in this way, or told this thing, or teacher told me this, or a coach told me that. And how does it show up? It shows up as, mid-40s guys on a podcast talking about their deep, dark desires. And I literally know that I'm deep, dark desires and fears. And I know that you've had way more of these conversations that I have as a pastor. Like, these are the things people bring. So Kent, as we wrap up here, let's talk about how people can learn more about the REST framework and learn more about you overall. I know you have something for the audience, and everything Kent's about to say, it's going in the show notes. No need to write it down. But Kent, what do you have for the audience here?
Yeah. So the best way to connect with me is through my website. And I put together, I have had a free resource for people. It's in crude form. So give me some grace in that. But it's an assessment called my Rhythms of Rest assessment, and it will help you pinpoint the areas on the rest framework that are the biggest pain points. So it's crude in the form that it's a Google form, but it's getting there. And the best way to connect with me is my website and my email list. So when you go to kentmurawski.com/burnout and just fill out the form, you'll get both the assessment and it will welcome you onto my weekly email list, which I write a weekly article on different themes about values and burnout and living whole and living with purpose and those types of things. So
yeah, I'll give you a plug. I think I joined your email list right when you spoke, and it's been you come with a high level of quality, and you can just tell that you have a high level of training and that writing is one of your gifts, and the way that you frame things and make it, again, make complex topics easy to do something with, which is what I always look for when I'm on an email list. Like, well, what can I do with this? And then what can I actually do with it besides just read it and learn something? Because if I just learn something but I don't do anything, all I did was learn something, and I've learned a lot of things that I haven't done things with. So Ken, I want to thank you for coming on, for saying yes to me when we met a few weeks ago, and it's been a pleasure to have you on. I know we're going to have you back on again. Wishing you and the fam the best of luck. I think the audience is probably going, this dude's pretty awesome. There's no way his kids aren't coming back. And if they're not, that's on them, Kent. That's on them. Don't make it about you. Kidding.
Well, Jason, I really appreciate you having me on. This has been so much fun, and look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Yeah, we'll see you again soon, Kent. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Talking to Cool People with Jason Frizzell. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and give us a shout out, or take a moment to leave a review on iTunes. If something from today's episode piqued your interest and you'd like to connect, email us at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com. We love hearing from our listeners because you're cool people too.